our next unit, we are going to be looking at a couple specific aspects of the blood. So the first part here is called Blood Basics, where we look at the makeup of the blood and some of the functions of the different types of components that are found in the blood. So what exactly is blood? Well, blood makes up about 8% of your body weight, so it's a significant portion of what makes you up. The average adult has anywhere between 4 to 6 liters of blood, so that's just right around a gallon. Blood, as we know, is a transport mechanism, so that's why I kind of call it a vehicle, because if you think about what vehicles do, they transport. So blood serves as a vehicle for distributing nutrients, like from food, respiratory gases, including carbon dioxide and oxygen, body heat, taking it from where it's generated in the core out to the extremities, and other substances that really don't fit into those first three categories, like water, and things that water tends to dissolve, like salts, medicines, and hormones. Blood itself, if you remember from the first unit, is a fluid connective tissue. So it's a type of tissue that's able to move, which when you think about some of the other tissues we've looked at, like muscle and bone, those aren't able to really move at all from place to place in the body. So blood is very unique in that aspect. Its pH is between 7.35 and 7.45, which puts it in the basic range of the pH scale. Remember that blood is a buffer, so that slightly basic pH means that it will react to help prevent the sudden changes in pH that could occur. Specifically, that basic pH helps to counteract the effects of the carbonic acid that we create in our blood when the carbon dioxide gets converted at the tissue level. Now, the two major components of the blood. The first one is the liquid portion, and we refer to the liquid portion as plasma. This is just a little bit over about half of our blood volume. This is mostly made up of water with a lot of dissolved substances like proteins and other solutes that we have. The other main portion of the blood is actually created, and they're cells. They're created by the body, and these are what we call the formed elements because our body actually makes them. This is the other 45%, and within it we have three main types of cells. The erythrocytes, which are the red blood cells, the leukocytes, which are the white blood cells, and the thrombocytes, which are also referred to as platelets. So if you look on the next page there's actually a diagram, and this is from your textbook, where if I take a sample of whole blood and I divide it down, I have the plasma up on top, and that's made up of plasma, proteins, other solutes, and water, and you can see some of those details here, which we will talk about. Whereas the formed elements, we have the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. And white blood cells have many different types. All right, so let's take a look at these different portions a little bit more closely. The first one is the plasma. This is the liquid portion that is right around 91% water. You may find some different areas that have different percentages, but that's essentially where it is, somewhere in that 90s or low 90s range. 7% of the plasma is made up of proteins, which includes proteins like albumin that is used to thicken the blood. And albumin, just to give you an example, is the primary protein found in egg whites. So if you think of a raw egg and that thick white, the thickness of the egg white itself when it's raw, that's what the albumin is, and that's how it thickens the blood. Globulins, these are typically antibodies that are present in the blood. They are a protein used to fight infection. And the third one we will talk about more in a little bit, fibrinogen. It is a protein produced by the liver that is necessary for proper blood clotting, which we will discuss. The other 2% is solutes, which include things like salts, nutrients, carbon dioxide and oxygen, as well as hormones. So this is kind of the other things that are dissolved in. In addition, a very tiny percentage of the plasma are cell fragments that are kind of floating around. As cells are die and are broken down in our recycling system within our bodies, some of those cell fragments and pieces actually get moved around within the blood to go to some of the different areas that recycle different components. All right, so that's the plasma. So let's take a closer look at the formed elements. This includes the erythrocytes, or the red blood cells. Their main function is to carry oxygen to all of the cells of the body. They are to stay in the blood vessels. If you find red blood cells outside of the blood vessels, then that's actually an indication that something is wrong. Red blood cells should not be found outside of the vessels. If I take a look at a red blood cell, they lack a nucleus as well as most other cell organelles, because as they grow and mature, they become packed with many molecules of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is an iron-containing protein that binds to oxygen. And if you think of the combination of iron and oxygen, that forms rust, which is kind of that reddish-orange color that we associate with red blood cells. The amount of hemoglobin that we have in our blood determines the amount of oxygen we are capable of carrying to our body cells. Now, if we don't have enough hemoglobin, then we can be described as anemic, or having a condition called anemia, which is where we have too little hemoglobin. This can be an iron deficiency issue, and you can actually take iron pills, or in the case of younger children, they actually give them iron drops. A lot of times this happens when kids are hitting growth spurts, where they have to really add on a lot of volume of red blood cells at a particular time, and their body just has a hard time keeping up with that. They do test you for your hemoglobin levels before you donate blood, because if you donate blood and you're anemic, you actually are putting yourself at risk for problems because of lack of oxygen in the tissues. Now, with red blood cells, the shape of the cell is very, very important for its ability to carry oxygen. And there is a disease that actually changes the shape of the red blood cells, and that is called sickle cell anemia. The cells themselves have kind of a sickle or crescent moon shape, which leaves them, I put on here unable, they're not able to bind it as well. They also, because they're not the normal shape, they don't have those nice smooth edges that allow them, red blood cells, to go through the capillaries without getting kind of snagged on the side. So they can get snagged on the walls of the blood vessels, which can cause them to get stuck and clog, or even to rupture. And when they rupture, they spill all of their hemoglobin out, which is actually not a good thing. And in your notes, you can see here two pictures of two different red blood cells. The typical red blood cell has kind of a jelly donut, or even I call it a snow tube shape. It doesn't, the hole that appears here does not go all the way through. It is a very deep depression, but it's not actually a true hole. But you can see the sickled red blood cell looks very, very different. Sickle cell anemia is something that is actually much more prevalent in African American populations, and that is because people with sickle cell anemia, or the heterozygous form, which is called sickle cell trait, where you have one copy of the bad gene, they actually are better able to survive certain diseases in the African region, like African sleeping sickness that's carried by the tsetse fly. African sleeping sickness causes swelling of the brain, which causes you to, quote, go to sleep. So it, through natural selection, that actually became much more prevalent in that population. It creates other problems, but the clogging and the rupturing of the blood cells, this disease kind of goes in flare-ups. So you always have it, but at certain times it just seems to get worse than others, where you get a lot of clogging, you get a lot of rupturing for whatever reason. It's something that can be life-threatening if you don't receive medical attention promptly with those. Just to give you an idea in terms of scope and size, if I have a single drop, or about a cubic millimeter of blood, there's about 5 million red blood cells in quantity that size. Now, I can also play the numbers game the other way. I can have too many red blood cells. This can result from bone marrow cancer or living at high altitudes. What this does is it causes blood thickness to increase, which can make your blood flow actually very sluggish, especially when you return to normal altitudes. This is different than blood doping, so the condition of polycythemia is actually something that is naturally occurring. It's a genetic environmental trait type of thing. Now, red blood cells are also formed through the process of erythropoiesis, and that is on the separate worksheet that you have. So if you take a look at that, you see this diagram, and the control of making red blood cells is actually done by the kidney, so that's where we're going to start. The kidney filters the blood, and as it filters the blood, it monitors a lot of things, and one of which is your oxygen level. So when it notices that the oxygen levels decline, the kidney sends out a message called a hormone. And it releases this hormone that is called erythropoietin, or EPO, or EPO. This is the hormone that blood dopers, athletes who blood dope, actually use to increase their red blood cell count. And if you listen to the Oprah interview with Lance Armstrong, they talk about this hormone. This hormone travels to the bone marrow, and it causes an increased mitotic or cell division rate in the bone marrow, and it also accelerates maturation. The mitosis rate is increased within the stem cells in the bone marrow. Remember, those are undifferentiated cells that are present. So they divide and mature. They first become the erythroblasts, which are the immature red blood cell. And you can tell that they are immature because of the dark structure that's inside of them, the nucleus. As we talked about before, the nucleus is not present in mature blood cells or mature erythrocytes. So the erythroblasts go through the maturation process to become erythrocytes, and then those erythrocytes are released into the blood. So we have more red blood cells that are circulating, which means that they're able to carry more oxygen, and that increases the oxygen tissue level the oxygen level in the blood, which then in turn increases the tissue oxygen level. And that leads to a cutoff in that production of the EPO. This is an example of negative feedback. My levels are low, and my body produces a response that increases it. So that is the red blood cell. But we have two other types of cells. The first one, or the next one, are the leukocytes, or the white blood cells. In terms of numbers, we have far less in that drop of blood. We only have about 4,000 to 11,000 per cubic millimeter. But this amount can change and fluctuate. In times of infection, we will have more. These are the only complete cell found in the blood. It has the nucleus and all of its organelles, and it is capable of dividing itself, unlike the red blood cell, which cannot. These are able to actually move in and out of the blood vessels. So it's okay to find white blood cells in the tissue area. What white blood cells do is they provide a protective, movable army, so they're mobile and protection force, that defends the body against damage by things like bacteria, viruses, parasites, and also tumor cells that our own body will produce. Now, we're going to go through three types of white blood cells, and you can see these in your textbook on table 11.3. The first one are the neutrophils. These are phagocytic white blood cells that are used for fighting short-term style infections. You have the basophils, which dilate or open up the blood vessels so that lumen, that opening of the blood vessels, opens up at the inflammation sites. The monocytes are kind of like the long-term cleanup mechanisms, and these are the cells that are affected by the disease mononucleosis. You can see where it gets the name. The eosinophils kill parasites and are also responsible for allergic reactions. And then the last type are the lymphocytes, and we will talk about these more when we get to the lymphatic system. We have two types of lymphocytes, the B lymphocyte and the T lymphocyte, and they produce antibodies. Now, leukocytes can also suffer from a couple of different diseases or display them. We can have leukopenia, where we have too few white blood cells, or leukemia, where we have too many. This is caused by bone cancer, bone marrow cancer, and we get a lot of white blood cells, but they're immature and they don't function. The key here is that both conditions reduce the body's ability to fight off infection. The last formed element are the platelets or thrombocytes. In a drop of blood, we have about 300,000 of them that are mostly made up of small cells or cell fragments. These are necessary for normal blood clotting, and they initiate something called the clotting cascade by clinging to the broken area of the blood vessel. What these do is they help control blood loss from a broken blood vessel. So what I want to do is I want to go through the 4 steps of the clotting cascade. I know in your notes you only see 1, 2, and 3, but the 3rd step actually has 2 parts to it, so that's why I call it 4. So in the clotting cascade, the first step is the platelets become sticky and actually bind to collagen fibers from the broken blood vessels at the injury site, and they form a platelet plug. Those anchored platelets release a hormone, serotonin, that you were familiar with from the nervous system, and this promotes blood vessel spasms. So the muscles in the wall of the blood vessel actually spasm and contract that and kind of clamp down the blood vessel to kind of close it off. This helps prevent blood loss between the platelet plug and the spasms. We get a temporary stoppage in the blood flow. This, however, does not create our typical clot, which we need to do and have in place in order for regeneration to happen. So that 3rd step is that process of coagulation, which is actually creating the clot. The first step, prothrombin, is released, and it is changed through a chemical reaction to form a different chemical called thrombin. That thrombin then mixes with calcium, and it takes the plasma protein fibrinogen and converts it into fibrin threads. These threads form a mesh over the breakage site, and it traps red blood cells. When those red blood cells get trapped, they form a clot that seals the vessel until the wound heals by regeneration. So those are the basic components of the blood. And in our next segment, we're going to talk about blood typing, cross-matching, transfusion reactions, and all of those types of things that also are associated with the blood, but they're not the true kind of anatomy and physiology of the blood itself.